In journalism, details drive the news. I'm Dennis Jers. I teach journalism at Seton Hill University. There are many differences between school essays and journalism. One is that a news story never begins with a pointlessly overgeneralized introduction like this one. Those are some sentences that you would expect to find at the beginning of a perfectly good student essay. Details drive the news, said Dennis Jers, who tells his journalism students to cut the essay-style filler. I'm not going to read this all word for word, but transitions are not necessary in journalism. Let the quotes do the heavy lifting for you, Jers said. And once you've made your point, as a journalist, do not feel obligated to carefully explain what point your sources just made. In high school, you got points doing that kind of thing when you are writing essays. It's not important in journalism. If we cut the filler, 25 words that actually convey newsworthy stuff. Even though journalistic articles tend to be shorter than the average academic paper, it might be a little frustrating to figure out, well, what goes into the space that you recover when you cut all that filler? Well, you put in the newsworthy stuff that makes your article relevant to your reader. Here's an example. Often, people don't recognize how much a seemingly insignificant childhood experience can affect them later in life. Now, if you were given a prompt in a high school English class to write a personal essay about a significant childhood experience, it's a great way to get at least some points if you repeat the prompt. But in journalism, it's a waste of time. And the person reading the news article is not a teacher who's sitting there with their grade book looking for reasons to give you points. So in this example, what people don't realize often is not journalism. Journalism is specific. Remember, details drive the news. Here we have a detail. Sally Smith is saying a particular thing. Sally Smith makes a comment about her father's sense of humor, and she says it has a big impact on her life, and she ends up saying, I'm a child psychologist. Well, okay. So this reporter is giving an opinion about somebody the reporter didn't even interview. So that's really subjective, and it's not good news writing. So there's a good idea here that Sally Smith is giving a specific incident that explained how this childhood incident affected her career. But where are the details? Let's cut that general opening. Writing a news story, a reporter is not supposed to announce what their opinions are. If we start this article with, I guess you'd say it was kind of quirky, here the reporter is quoting Sally Smith's opinions, and Sally Smith is a high-quality, a qualified source to have an opinion about her father's sense of humor, because she knew her father. If we cut that filler, we have room then to present something else, something better. Here, instead of the reporter's opinion, we have the source's opinion. Yes, it is often a good idea to lead a story with a quote. But in this case, because Sally doesn't actually say, my father's sense of humor was quirky, the words that Sally Smith said, she actually just said it. So a reporter can't, change Sally Smith's words. You could put brackets and change the word it to my father's sense of humor, but then you're not really using Sally Smith's words. This is just not an efficient way to get into a story. This quote needs context before we understand what's happening. In this version, we just start with, a woman sitting in her childhood living room remembers her father. So when we get to a quote in which we have the word he, it's not necessary to write, when asked to convey a childhood memory. We can read for ourselves that the quote is about a childhood memory, so it's not necessary to summarize what the quote is about at that level of detail. That's wordy. The father makes a kind of odd joke. I'm going to miss you when we send you back to the factory, said Sally Smith, a child psychologist. It probably influenced my choice of career. Okay? So we have no unnecessary details in that opening. Bare information that we need to understand the quote. Here, it's not the reporter's opinion, but it's Sally's opinion about her father that matters. Again, let the details drive the story. In the opening, we don't need to know the color of the couch the woman is sitting on, or what her hair looks like, or what music is playing, or whether there's a clock ticking or a cat purring nearby. Maybe later in the story, if those details will help you tell the story, you can include them. But it's not important right now. So these are all steps in the right direction. When done right, journalism is storytelling. So on the left, we have vague and general. On the right, we've got a joke. A woman talks about her father. He hugged me tight. She quotes a weird joke that her father said. The story says she's a child psychologist, and we get Sally saying it influenced my choice of career. We would have the news hook. This example about Sally Smith is newsworthy because the reporter has interviewed Sally Smith to get a specific story to tell, which ties into the fact that the government recently published a study about Generation Z college graduates. So that third paragraph explains why this quote from Sally Smith is newsworthy. And in this version, we've got a joke that works. Okay? So that's good. So instead of, on the left, telling a general point, what people often don't realize, and then following up with an example of Sally Smith realizing something, let's just show this. We assume Sally Smith is somebody from the reporter's own local community, somebody that readers of that publication will likely know. So we cut, one example of this is, we cut things like, this can be seen because. Phrases like that, you've been trained to write that way in high school English, because your high school English teacher wants to give you points for demonstrating you can connect facts. A person reading a news story doesn't already know the facts and is not sitting there with a gradebook in hand waiting to give you points for connecting those facts. So that's one of the differences between writing a good high school or freshman comp essay and a good news story. So leaving Sally Smith aside, here's a new example. Let the quotes do the heavy lifting. Let's imagine that you're a reporter writing a story in which you've interviewed Dennis Jers. My beginning journalism students often will introduce their quotes with something like this. When I asked him about a particular topic, then they will summarize the quote, and then they'll give the quote, and they'll explain why the quote is significant. In their high school English classes, they were told, introduce your quote, give the quote, and then explain why the quote matters. That's a common formula in high school writing or freshman comp. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just not good journalism. Usually, when I see the phrase when asked about, I look for things to throw. Dennis Jers warned his journalism class. That phrase emphasizes the reporter, who should instead try to remain invisible. Jers told about 10 students at Seton Hill University Monday. The version on the left foregrounds the reporter, when I asked about, and it ends with the reporter's opinion. In high school, you're supposed to write paragraphs that clearly state your opinions. But in 50 words on the left, that version is less newsworthy than the version on the right, which only uses 43 words. So in fewer words, we get 2 details from the source Dennis Jers. One is a direct quote and one is paraphrased. We also have facts like where this event was taking place, and the fact that Dennis Jers is a journalism teacher talking to his students in class it explains why this quote is newsworthy, because this quote is telling the readers, well, Dennis Jers knows something about journalism because he's teaching a college journalism class. I should note, there are many people out there who know far more about journalism than I do, but in terms of this news story, the fact that Dennis Jers is teaching a journalism class in college it conveys some authority to that quote and makes it worth putting in a news story. The quote here is driving the story on the right. On the left, it's the reporter's experiences and opinions and like kind of the reporter's personal journey of discovery that's driving the story. Okay, let's imagine we're writing a story about something called the Steelsburg UFO Convention. Okay, so this is there's nothing wrong with the writing of this paragraph, but I'd like you to think about what are some ways that we can make this paragraph more newsworthy. How can we revise this paragraph to make it more journalistic and less like an essay? There were many people wearing costumes that were creative or simply unusual at the Steelsburg UFO Convention. About 500 people attended this annual event. One of these people was Jim Smith, who showed up wearing a tinfoil hat and a frilly pink tutu. Other notable costumes included a woman dressed as a Teletubby and a man wearing a cardboard box. All were spotted sitting at the same cafe table Saturday afternoon. Okay, so think for a moment. What are the strengths of this paragraph? And if a cub reporter came to you and said, how could I improve this paragraph? How can I make this a better, more newsworthy story? Well, this version does quite a lot right. I mean, we've got some specific details. We've got a number for how many people there are. We've got details about one particular person. Journalism is all about specifics. The fact that this writer has zeroed in on one person named Jim Smith and given us some details about Jim Smith is wearing, that's a specific example that shows the reader the creativity and the oddness and the unusualness of the costumes. We mention a woman in a different costume and a man in a different costume. There's some different details, and we have where it took place. We've got that the convention is annual. We've got that they're sitting in a cafe table. Okay, there's some basic details, but there's not a lot here to grab the reader. We're starting to get a picture of Jim Smith, but there's no sense that this reporter talked to Jim Smith. The fact that these people were spotted sitting at a cafe table, the reporter could have been looking out of the window of their car as they drove past and saw them. This isn't really an intimate conversation with anybody. What's good is we've got some details, but instead of just saying a woman dressed as the Teletubby, what if you mentioned that it was a lawyer? And instead of just a man wearing a cardboard box, how about a homeschooling dad wearing only a cardboard box? I think homeschooling and only adds something a little bit to the story. Again, the fact that it's not just a woman but a lawyer dressed as Teletubby, it suggests that these are, kind of ordinary people doing unusual things, and that makes the story a little bit more newsworthy. I think this is working. Let's cut the reference to many people. Just say 500 people. So that's what I like about the revision. Instead of references to there were many people, one of these people was, and about 500 people, just say about 500 people. In this version, the details are driving the story. But let's think about what's happening here. This is a story about the Steelsburg UFO Convention. But the Steelsburg UFO Convention, the name of the event, is buried after a lot of details. So although it is good to use details, like many things in life, I'll go for moderation. I would say these are too many details that bury the news. Journalists like to emphasize their ability to get original, fresh interviews with newsworthy people. This opening doesn't, we've lost our focus on Jim the individual. He's just a man in a tutu. So I think this version loses something. Even though the details are good, this list of general details is not specific enough to drive this story. I come here every year. It's a fun opportunity to see and be seen. Look at all the weirdos here. I love it. Last year I was a washing machine. I think Joe here is dressed as the box my washing machine came in. Okay. That's a pretty good quote from Jim Smith, but it's too long. If you opened your story with that, we would have no idea what the heck you're reading. Let's just try cutting this quote down to the bare minimum. Look at all the weirdos here, said Jim Smith, a 57-year-old electrician from Rogersville who attended the 2021 Steelsburg UFO Convention wearing a tinfoil hat and a frilly pink tutu. I love it. Notice, there's no need to add something like added Smith. We already know that since this the words "I love it" are part of the same paragraph where the only person speaking, the only person mentioned is Jim Smith. The convention is we know that Jim Smith is the person who said the words "I love it." So there's no need to end this paragraph with "added Smith" or something like that. All right. I would probably say calling him a 27-year-old electrician from Rogersville, though that's a nice detail, it buries the news. Remember, let the details drive the story, but don't let the details bury the story. So let's trim it down. And let's put that detail about the 57-year-old electrician from Rogersville, let's put that in the second paragraph. The second paragraph will mention that this person is one of 500 watching the opening parade. Okay, so look at all the weirdos here, said Jim Smith, who attended the 2021 Steelsburg UFO Convention while wearing a tinfoil hat and a frilly pink tutu. I love it. That's pretty good. We can do better. Instead of who attended while wearing, let's trim that down. Said Jim Smith at the convention wearing a tinfoil hat. Of course he said this while wearing it. If he's at it, we know he attended it. So we can trim out, we trimmed out a whole line of text. You wouldn't even notice where those missing words went. Good journalism trims out unnecessary words to make room for more newsworthy words. So this is getting much, much better. But there is one completely unnecessary word in the version on the right. Can you spot it? The point of a tutu is to have frills. It's not a tutu if it's not frilly. So calling something a frilly tutu is redundant. Let's just drop that word frilly. Okay? The version on the right is efficient. It zeroes in on one character and allows us to absorb the news through this person's words. The version on the right is more informative. It's more efficient. It wastes fewer words. Unfortunately, the version on the right is soul-crushingly boring. In part 2 of this lecture, we'll talk about taking this functional, correct, but boring story and making it more interesting, more relevant, and more newsworthy. And we do it through details. This is Dennis Jers teaching journalism at Seton Hill University.